The question of the tithe, I think again what we were talking about earlier, that the New Testament standard is higher than the Old Testament. Tithe was a tax. It was a law that was imposed on the Jews as a law. When we come to the New Testament, we don't just throw out the law in the sense of saying, well, all that's worthless to me. And just to give you one example, we know from the law of Moses that it is reasonable for a church of 10 families to be able to support one family. We know that that's not an unreasonable burden. 20 families certainly ought to be able to support 2 elders or pastors. There's many things that we can learn from the law in that way, and one thing we can learn from the law is just how generous even the Jewish people were. When you come to the New Testament, you don't have any verses that teach tithing. Except things that were happening directly during the gospel times when the Lord was present and we're still under the law. In other words, there's a transition happening. I think it's a good starting point for giving. And so as Christians, we could say, well, this is somewhere that I can start. I can start with giving 10%. Now, I think there are times when somebody has, by their former sins or former lifestyle, has gotten themselves into debt, and they have to not pay some other debt that they already have in order to tithe. And in those situations, I think there can be times where it's right for them to pay off their debts. But if they keep on in a situation where they can't even give 10%, I think that's saying there's something probably wrong here. Many Christian businessmen who have lived on the 10% and tithe 90%. You have the case of the widow's mite. The Lord Jesus said she put in all that she had to live on. So there's sometimes where the giving, and in Corinthians he talks about them giving according to their ability and beyond their ability. They give freely. So there can be times where that can be right too. If we're looking for a rule of thumb of something to start out with, I'd say the tithe is a good thing to start out with.
I just look at it as, I mean, if in this Old Testament dispensation they gave 10%, in this gospel dispensation, I mean, that's got to be, you know, just a tiny starting place. If I'm giving 10%, I at least know that my heart isn't totally cold towards God.